Global economic collapse doesn't announce itself with headlines, it starts quietly, with small signals most people ignore, isolated incidents that seem unconnected, until suddenly, they're not isolated anymore, and by the time the pattern becomes obvious, the collapse is already well underway. This video examines 5 signs that match every historical pre-collapse period, not predictions, observable patterns, and all 5 are visible right now. Economic collapse feels like it happens overnight. One day the system functions, the next day it doesn't, but that perception is false. Collapse is a process, not an event, and that process always leaves evidence, specific patterns, measurable indicators, warning signs that appear in sequence across different collapse scenarios throughout history. This isn't speculation, this is pattern recognition based on documented economic data from currency collapses, banking crises, and systemic failures spanning centuries. And once you understand these patterns, you can see them forming in real time, before the media acknowledges them, before the general population realizes what's happening, before the final stage becomes irreversible, because by the time collapse makes front-page news, the wealth transfer has already occurred. The damage is already done. The opportunities to position differently have already passed. The question this video answers is simple: are we currently in a pre-collapse period? And the historical data suggests we might be. Before we examine the 5 specific signs, we need to understand how economic collapse actually unfolds, because popular perception gets this fundamentally wrong. Most people imagine collapse as a sudden crash, stock market panic, bank runs, currency hyperinflation happening simultaneously. But documented historical collapses don't follow that pattern. Collapse happens in stages. Each stage can last months or years, and each stage displays specific characteristics that become visible before the next stage begins. Stage 1: excessive debt accumulation relative to economic output. Governments borrow continuously to fund operations because tax revenue no longer covers expenses. Debt compounds faster than the economy grows. Stage 2: interest payments on that debt begin consuming significant portions of government revenue. This creates a debt spiral, borrowing to pay interest on previous borrowing. Stage 3: central banks intervene to suppress interest rates by purchasing government debt. This is monetary expansion. More currency units entering the system, each unit worth slightly less. Stage 4: real-world prices begin rising faster than official inflation statistics report. The gap between reported numbers and actual cost of living widens. People feel poorer but data says everything is fine. Stage 5: essential goods pricing decouples from discretionary goods pricing. Food, energy, and housing inflate rapidly while manufactured goods see modest increases or deflation. The burden falls on those spending most income on necessities. Stage 6: social unrest increases as purchasing power erodes. Political instability rises. Governments respond with controls, subsidies, or additional monetary expansion, all of which accelerate the underlying problem. Stage 7: currency loses function. Barter economies emerge. Wealth held in cash evaporates. Productive assets and practical skills become primary stores of value. Not every collapse reaches stage 7, some stabilize at stage 4 or 5 through painful adjustment, but the progression from stage 1 through stage 7 has repeated across Weimar Germany, Argentina, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, and dozens of other documented cases. The mechanism is always the same: excessive debt, monetary expansion, currency debasement, inflation, and eventual system failure or restructuring. Now here are the 5 signs that indicate this process has already begun, and why each one matters. The first sign is coordinated global debt expansion without any clear repayment mechanism. Not just one country borrowing excessively, multiple major economies simultaneously running structural deficits with no realistic path to balance. Why does this matter? Because when debt accumulation happens across interconnected economies simultaneously, it creates systemic risk. One country's crisis triggers others, currency debasements cascade, and the ability to stabilize through external support disappears because everyone needs support at once. The current data is stark. Global debt reached over $300 trillion. That's roughly 340% of global GDP. Government debt, corporate debt, and household debt all at historic highs simultaneously. The United States federal debt exceeds $38 trillion, over 130% of GDP, and the Congressional Budget Office projects deficits continuing indefinitely with no path to stabilization. Japan's government debt exceeds 260% of GDP, the highest debt-to-GDP ratio among developed nations, and despite decades of economic policy attempts, that ratio continues rising. European Union member states collectively carry debt averaging 90% of GDP, several members exceed 120%, and Eurozone mechanisms for managing sovereign debt crises remain inadequate based on past performance. China's total debt, including local government financing vehicles and state-owned enterprises, is estimated between 300 to 350% of GDP, hidden leverage that creates systemic fragility. This is an isolated excess. This is coordinated global debt expansion happening simultaneously across all major economic zones. And here's what makes this different from past periods. For the first time in modern history, every major economy is running structural deficits simultaneously. There's no external creditor with capacity to provide support during crisis, no surplus economy to stabilize the system. When crisis emerges, who lends to everyone at once? The answer is no one, which means central banks create money, which means coordinated monetary expansion, which means synchronized currency debasement. Historical precedent is clear. The 1930s saw multiple countries simultaneously attempting competitive currency devaluations. The 1970s saw coordinated inflation across developed economies. Both periods preceded significant economic restructuring with wealth destruction for those holding cash and fixed income assets. The current debt levels exceed both historical periods by substantial margins, and the demographic challenges of aging populations make repayment through growth increasingly unrealistic. This is sign number one: coordinated global debt expansion at levels historically associated with systemic crisis, not in the future, already present, already measurable. The second sign is accelerating central bank balance sheet expansion after previous attempts to reduce them failed. This indicates that economies have become dependent on monetary stimulus and cannot function without it. Central bank balance sheets represent the scale of monetary intervention in the economy. When central banks purchase assets, government bonds, mortgage-backed securities, or corporate debt, they expand their balance sheet, and they create new money to make those purchases. The larger the balance sheet, the more monetary expansion has occurred, and the more dependent the system becomes on continued expansion. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion before 2008 to over $4 trillion by 2015. They attempted to reduce it between 2017 and 2019. Markets became unstable, economic growth slowed. By 2020, they reversed course and expanded to over $9 trillion. Attempts to reduce the balance sheet again in 2021 and 2022 triggered market volatility and regional banking stress. Multiple banks failed, the Fed slowed the reduction, the balance sheet remains over $7 trillion. The European Central Bank's balance sheet expanded from under €2 trillion before 2008 to over €8 trillion by 2020. Attempts to reduce it have been minimal and halting because European government bond markets become unstable without ECB support. The Bank of Japan's balance sheet exceeds 600 trillion yen, over 130% of Japan's GDP. The largest relative to economy size of any major central bank, and they've never successfully reduced it because Japanese government financing depends on Bank of Japan purchases. The People's Bank of China expanded its balance sheet from under 20 trillion yuan in 2008 to over 40 trillion yuan currently, and continues expanding to support economic growth targets. The pattern is consistent. Central banks expanded balance sheets in response to the 2008 crisis. They attempted to normalize. The attempts failed because economies couldn't function without monetary support, and they've been forced to maintain or expand balance sheets ever since. This is financial dependency. The system requires continuous monetary expansion to operate. Any attempt to reduce that expansion triggers instability. Why does this matter? Because balance sheet expansion is currency creation. More currency units in circulation, each unit worth incrementally less. This is the mechanism of currency debasement, and once an economy becomes dependent on this mechanism, stopping it triggers crisis, but continuing it accelerates inflation. There's no stable equilibrium, only a choice between immediate disruption from stopping or gradual erosion from continuing. Historical precedent shows this pattern. Weimar Germany attempted to stabilize the mark multiple times between 1921and 1923. Each attempt failed because the economy had become dependent on monetary expansion to function. Eventually, the currency collapsed completely. Argentina experienced multiple currency crises throughout the late 20th century following the same pattern: monetary expansion to support government spending, dependency on that expansion, failed attempts to stabilize, eventual crisis, and currency restructuring. The current situation differs in scale. This isn't one central bank expanding its balance sheet, it's coordinated expansion across all major central banks simultaneously, which means synchronized dependency and synchronized inability to reverse course without triggering global instability. This is sign number 2, central bank balance sheet dependency at levels that indicate the system cannot function without continuous monetary expansion. Already present, already measurable, already creating inflationary pressure. The third sign is persistent real wage decline despite moderate official inflation reporting. This indicates the gap between official statistics and actual cost of living is widening systematically. Real wages are nominal wages adjusted for inflation. If your paycheck increases 3% but inflation is 5%, your real wage declined 2%. You're poorer in purchasing power terms even though you received a raise. The mechanism matters because governments have strong incentives to underreport inflation. Many government obligations adjust automatically with reported inflation: Social Security benefits, government pensions, inflation index bonds. Higher reported inflation means higher government costs, so measurement methodologies evolve in ways that tend to understate actual price increases. Quality adjustments, substitution effects, excluding volatile categories, hedonic adjustments for technology improvements. These adjustments may have theoretical validity, but they systematically produce official numbers lower than the price increases people actually experience for goods they actually purchase. The data reveals the divergence. From 2020to 2024, official cumulative inflation in the United States totaled approximately 20%. Actual price increases for essential categories exceeded that substantially. Housing costs in major metropolitan areas increased 40 to 70% depending on location. Rents in cities like Austin, Phoenix, and Miami increased over 50% in 4 years. Food prices increased 30 to 40% cumulatively. Basic items like eggs, bread, meat, and dairy all saw increases exceeding official inflation by significant margins. Auto insurance costs doubled in many states. Health insurance premiums increased 30 to 40%. Childcare costs increased 25 to 35%. Meanwhile, nominal wage growth averaged roughly 4% annually. Cumulative wage growth over 4 years was approximately 16%. So wages grew 16% while actual costs of living grew 30 to 50% depending on category mix. Real purchasing power declined substantially. People feel poorer because they are poorer. But official statistics report moderate inflation and real wage stagnation rather than decline. This divergence between official reporting and actual experience is a classic pre-collapse indicator, because it means the measurement systems designed to track economic health are no longer accurately reflecting reality. And when measurement fails, policy fails, decisions get made based on inaccurate data, problems compound unaddressed, and by the time the gap becomes undeniable, the damage is extensive. Historical precedent is consistent. Soviet economic statistics in the 1980s showed growth while actual output declined. Argentine inflation statistics in the early 2000s understated actual price increases by substantial margins. Venezuelan official inflation numbers bore no relationship to actual price changes. In each case, the divergence between official reporting and reality preceded systemic crisis. Because once governments begin systematically misreporting economic conditions, trust in the currency and the system erodes. The current situation shows this pattern. Official inflation reports moderate, real-world experience severe, gap widening, trust declining. This is sign number 3, persistent real wage decline masked by systematically understated inflation reporting, already present, already measurable, already eroding purchasing power for wage earners while protecting asset holders. The fourth sign is essential goods price inflation significantly exceeding discretionary goods pricing. This indicates currency debasement is hitting necessities harder than luxuries, placing disproportionate burden on those with least capacity to absorb it. When inflation is evenly distributed across all goods and services, it represents general currency debasement, painful but broadly shared. But when essential goods inflate significantly faster than discretionary goods, it signals a more dangerous pattern. Essential goods are items required for survival: food, energy for heating and cooking, housing, basic medical care, transportation to employment. These are non-discretionary, people must purchase them regardless of price. Discretionary goods are everything else: electronics, clothing beyond basics, entertainment, travel, restaurant, meals. These are adjustable, people can delay or eliminate these purchases when budgets tighten. When essential goods inflate faster than discretionary goods, it creates a bifurcated economy. Those spending most income on essentials experience severe inflation. Those with discretionary income experience moderate inflation. Inequality accelerates rapidly. The current data shows this pattern clearly. Food inflation has consistently exceeded general inflation since 2020. In 2022, food price increases reached 9% annually in the United States, while general inflation was reported at 8%, but food represents a larger portion of spending for lower-income households. Energy prices have been extremely volatile. Natural gas prices in Europe increased over 300% at peaks in 2022. U.S. gasoline prices doubled from 2020 lows to 1022小时 ICE. Heating oil prices increased similarly. Housing costs have detached completely from wage growth. Median home prices in the United States increased from approximately $320,000 in 2020 to over $420,000 by 2024, a 30% increase, while wages grew 16%. Rent increases have been even more severe in high-demand areas. Median rents in cities like Austin, Miami, and Phoenix increased 40 to 60% in 4 years. Meanwhile, many manufactured goods saw minimal price increases or actual deflation. Electronics, furniture, appliances, clothing. Global manufacturing capacity and competitive markets kept these prices relatively stable. The result is a growing disparity. Households spending 70% of income on food, housing, and energy experienced effective inflation rates of 30 to 40%. Households spending 40% of income on those categories experienced effective inflation of 15 to 20%. This creates social pressure. When large portions of the population cannot afford food, energy, and housing on their current incomes, political instability increases. Governments respond with subsidies, price controls, or monetary transfers. All of these responses increase government spending, which increases deficits, which requires more borrowing or monetary expansion, which accelerates inflation. The cycle reinforces itself. Historical precedent shows this pattern consistently. In Venezuela, food and medicine prices increased thousands of percent while some imported luxury goods remained available at relatively stable dollar prices. The bifurcation signaled the bolivar was collapsing for essential transactions. In Zimbabwe during hyperinflation, fuel and food prices increased exponentially while some durable goods showed less dramatic increases. Again, the pattern indicated currency failure for basic necessities even while some sectors retained partial stability. Weimar Germany showed the same pattern. Food prices increased faster than industrial goods. The burden fell disproportionately on wage earners and those dependent on fixed incomes. The mechanism is straightforward. When currency loses value, the first effects appear in goods with immediate consumption. Food rots, energy is consumed. These cannot be stored indefinitely, so price discovery happens rapidly. Durable goods can be stored, sold later. Prices adjust more slowly because time arbitrage is possible. The lag between essential goods inflation and durable goods inflation is a signal that currency debasement is progressing. This is sign number 4, essential goods pricing significantly exceeding discretionary goods inflation. Already present, already measurable, already creating social pressure that governments will respond to with policies that accelerate the underlying problem. The 5th sign is accelerating dedollarization and central bank gold accumulation at the fastest pace in decades. This indicates institutional actors are positioning for reduced confidence in fiat currencies generally and the dollar specifically. The US dollar has functioned as the global reserve currency since the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. International trade denominated in dollars. Central banks hold dollar reserves, commodities priced in dollars. This creates continuous global demand for dollars regardless of U.S. economic fundamentals. But that status is not permanent. It's conditional on continued confidence in dollar stability and U.S. economic management, and that confidence is eroding. The data shows the trend clearly. Central bank gold purchases reached the highest levels since 1950. In 2022, central banks purchased over 1,000 metric tons of gold. In 2023, purchases exceeded 1,000 metric tons again. This represents a dramatic reversal. From 2008 to 2020, central bank gold purchases averaged 400 to 500 metric tons annually. The recent acceleration to over 1,000 metric tons indicates a strategic shift, and the composition matters. The largest purchasers are central banks in China, Russia, India, Turkey, and other nations seeking to reduce dollar dependency. These aren't Western central banks diversifying. These are non-Western central banks explicitly reducing dollar exposure. China's official gold reserves increased from approximately 1,000 metric tons in 2015 to over 2,000 metric tons by 2024. But many analysts believe actual holdings are significantly higher because China has incentives to underreport strategic gold accumulation. Russia's central bank gold reserves exceeded 2,300 metric tons before Western sanctions in 2022 froze access to dollar reserves. That experience accelerated de-dollarization efforts among nations concerned about similar sanctions. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have explicitly discussed creating alternative payment systems and reserve currencies to reduce dollar dependency, while implementation remains incomplete. The coordination indicates strategic alignment toward de-dollarization. Trade settlements outside the dollar are increasing. China and Russia settled over 50% of bilateral trade in yuan or rubles by 2023. China and Saudi Arabia have conducted oil transactions in yuan. These developments gradually erode dollar dominance in commodity markets. Why does this matter? Because dollar reserve status creates structural demand for U.S. government debt. Foreign central banks purchase U.S. treasuries to hold dollar reserves. This allows the U.S. government to borrow at lower interest rates than fundamentals would otherwise support. If that demand erodes, interest rates rise, debt service costs increase. The debt spiral accelerates, and the Federal Reserve faces pressure to purchase more government debt to suppress rates, which means more monetary expansion, which means more inflation. The historical precedent is stark. The British pound functioned as global reserve currency before the dollar. The transition from pound to dollar dominance occurred gradually through the early 20th century as British economic fundamentals weakened and confidence eroded. The process took decades, but it was marked by specific signs: reduced trade settlement in pounds, central banks diversifying reserves away from pounds, capital outflows from Britain, and eventual currency devaluation and economic restructuring. The current signs mirror that pattern: reduced trade settlement in dollars, central bank diversification toward gold and other currencies, capital flows shifting toward assets denominated in other currencies. This doesn't mean the dollar will lose reserve status next year, but it means the process has begun, and once confidence begins eroding, the process tends to accelerate, because reserve currency status depends on perception of stability, and perception shifts can be self-reinforcing. This is sign number 5, accelerating de-dollarization and central bank gold accumulation, indicating institutional preparation for reduced fiat currency confidence, already present, already measurable, already indicating that major economic actors are positioning for systemic change. Now we need to examine what these 5 signs mean when they appear simultaneously, because individually, each signal can exist without triggering collapse, but when all 5 appear together, the historical pattern becomes unmistakable. Coordinated global debt expansion, central bank balance sheet dependency, persistent real wage decline masked by understated inflation, essential goods pricing decoupling, and de-dollarization with gold accumulation. Each of these signs has appeared individually during various economic stress periods without triggering full systemic collapse. High debt can persist if growth remains strong. Central bank expansion can be temporary crisis response. Real wages can decline temporarily during recessions. Essential goods can inflate during supply shocks. Currency confidence can fluctuate without terminal decline. But when all five signals appear simultaneously and persist, every historical precedent shows significant economic disruption follows, not always hyperinflation, not always currency collapse, but always substantial wealth transfer, purchasing power loss, and system restructuring. The timing varies, some transitions took years, others accelerated rapidly, but the direction proved consistent. Debt levels that couldn't be repaid through growth eventually get inflated away, central bank expansion eventually creates inflation, real wage decline eventually forces political response, essential goods inflation eventually triggers social unrest, and currency confidence loss eventually requires restructuring. The question isn't whether these conditions resolve, they always do. The question is how they resolve, through managed adjustment, through crisis and restructuring, or through complete system failure and replacement. Managed adjustment requires political will to make difficult decisions, spending cuts, tax increases, entitlement reform. Debt restructuring, historically, these adjustments rarely happen voluntarily, they typically require crisis to generate political consensus. Crisis in restructuring is more common: currency devaluation, debt default or restructuring, asset price crashes, wealth destruction for holders of cash and fixed income securities, wealth preservation for holders of hard assets and productive capacity. This is the pattern that occurred in numerous countries over the past century. Complete system failure is rare but not unprecedented: Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, Venezuela. These represent terminal currency failure requiring complete monetary system replacement. This is the worst case outcome, but it happens when other adjustments are avoided too long. The current global situation contains elements suggesting we are past the point where managed adjustment is politically feasible: debt levels too high to repay through growth, populations too dependent on government transfers to accept cuts, political systems too polarized to generate consensus on painful reforms. Which suggests crisis and restructuring is the more likely path, not next month, not necessarily next year, but within a timeframe where current economic relationships restructure significantly. What does that mean practically? It means assets denominated in currency, cash savings accounts, bonds with fixed returns, lose purchasing power. Assets with intrinsic value or productive capacity, real estate, commodities, businesses with pricing power, productive skills, maintain or increase relative value. It means those holding only cash and fixed income assets experience wealth destruction. Those holding productive assets experience wealth preservation or growth as nominal prices adjust to currency debasement. It means the gap between official reporting and real-world experience continues widening until the divergence becomes politically unsustainable. Then adjustments happen rapidly through crisis rather than gradually through policy. Historical evidence from multiple collapse scenarios shows this pattern consistently. The transition from apparent stability to obvious crisis happens faster than institutional projections suggest, because measurement systems lag reality, and because confidence shifts non-linearly. For months or years, confidence holds despite deteriorating fundamentals. Then a trigger event, often minor, causes rapid reassessment, capital flows reverse, currency pressure accelerates, and the transition everyone knew was coming eventually arrives faster than anyone expected immediately. So here's what we've covered. Global economic collapse doesn't announce itself. It starts quietly with measurable signs that appear in sequence across every documented historical case. 5 specific signs indicate the process has begun: coordinated global debt expansion, central bank balance sheet dependency, persistent real wage decline, essential goods price decoupling, and dedollarization with gold accumulation. All 5 signs are currently present simultaneously across major global economies. This doesn't guarantee collapse next month, but it indicates systemic stress at levels historically associated with significant restructuring. The pattern is clear from documented historical precedent: excessive debt leads to monetary expansion. Monetary expansion leads to currency debasement. Currency debasement leads to inflation. Inflation leads to wealth transfer from currency holders to asset holders, and confidence loss eventually forces system restructuring. The timing is uncertain, the direction is not. Understanding these patterns doesn't prevent their occurrence, but it provides clarity about positioning before restructuring accelerates, because once crisis becomes obvious, repositioning opportunities close rapidly. This is financial history decoded, pattern analysis of economic collapse. Based on documented historical evidence, the 5 signs examined here aren't predictions, they're observations of conditions that historically precede systemic change, and they're visible right now.